She unwrapped a single pound of ground beef and set it on the Formica counter. By Friday, that one block of meat had fed 5 people 3 different times. It wasn't a recipe. It was a mathematical survival mechanism disguised as dinner. You didn't ask how she did it. You just sat at the table and ate what was put in front of you. These are the 15 forgotten meals that stretched the meat and kept the lights on. And the exact moment the food industry realized they could box up that desperation and sell it back to them. Number 15. Cracker stretched meatloaf. A single pound of cheap ground chuck cost 65 cents in 1972, but it shrank in the oven. A grandmother in Ohio kept a rolling pin specifically for crushing saltines inside the wax sleeve. She crushed them until they were a fine, salty dust, then folded them into the raw meat with 1 beaten egg and a heavy pour of whole milk. The crackers acted like a sponge, absorbing the rendered fat that would have otherwise cooked off. When she sliced it, it looked like a massive 2-pound loaf. You ate it drowning in ketchup to mask the dry, starchy texture of the filler. She made it every Sunday. By Tuesday, the leftovers were gone, and the rolling pin was back in the drawer, waiting for next week. Number 14. Hamburger gravy over white bread. A 1/4 pound of ground beef, browned in a cast-iron skillet. The meat wasn't the meal. The meat was just the flavoring for the flour. She left every drop of grease in the pan, whisked in a heavy handful of all-purpose flour to make a thick paste, and slowly poured in milk until it blossomed into a dense, bubbling gray gravy. She ladled it heavily over 2 slices of generic white bread. You had to eat it fast before the hot gravy completely dissolved the cheap bread into a gummy, unswallowable paste. A mother in rural Pennsylvania made this every Wednesday night before her swing shift. She served the children first, making sure the ladle scraped the bottom of the pan to get the actual chunks of meat. When she made her own plate, it was just the gray gravy and the bread. She ate standing at the counter so she could wash the pan before she left for work. Number 13. The half burger. A single patty pressed aggressively thin with a metal spatula. When it was done, she took a kitchen knife and sliced it perfectly down the middle. 2 children, 2 generic hamburger buns, half a patty in each. You filled the rest of the bun with cheap mustard and raw white onions to make it feel heavy. The onions were sharp enough to distract from the fact that the meat was gone in 3 bites. You chewed the onions slowly to make the sandwich last longer than it should have. That was the easy part of the week. The first 3 meals on this list had one thing in common. The meat was still present. You could see it, smell it, find it on the plate. A mother in 1972 could still put dinner on the table and have it look like dinner. But that window closed fast. By the middle of the week, the math had shifted, and the cooking had to shift with it. The meals stopped being about making the meat go further. They started being about making the family believe there was still meat at all. That required a different set of skills, not cooking skills. Performance skills. Because by then, dinner wasn't about feeding people anymore. It was about convincing them they had been fed. Number 12. Macaroni and tomatoes with beef. A box of elbow macaroni cost 19 cents. A can of stewed tomatoes only cost 15. She browned maybe 3 ounces of hamburger meat, breaking it apart with a wooden spoon until the pieces were no larger than a pencil eraser. When she folded the pasta and the acidic, watery tomatoes into the pot, the meat practically disappeared. But the grease coated the noodles, tricking the brain into thinking you were eating a heavy protein dinner. The pot made enough for 2 nights. The second night it was thicker, the tomato liquid absorbed into the pasta, and the pencil eraser-sized pieces of beef were even harder to find. But you ate it anyway. Number 11. Porcupine meatballs. A mother in Detroit would mix half a cup of uncooked rice directly into a half pound of seasoned ground beef, rolling them tightly into golf ball-sized spheres. She dropped them into a simmering bath of thinned-out tomato soup and covered the pot. Over 45 minutes, the raw rice absorbed the acidic tomato broth and the beef fat, bloating from the inside out. The grains of rice literally pierced through the surface of the meat as they expanded. By the time she took the lid off, the meatballs had doubled in size. She set 4 of them on each plate. They looked enormous. They were mostly just rice. People call these nostalgia meals now. She wasn't cooking nostalgia. She was buying one more day. This is where the week changed. The first 5 meals were about making the meat look like more than it was, stretching the volume, hiding the math behind a rolling pin and a cast iron pan and a pot of gray gravy. But by midweek, the meat was running out faster than the week was. And the calculation shifted from how do we make this look like enough to something harder. Something that required a different kind of thinking entirely. Because there is a specific moment in every week like this when a mother stops cooking and starts rationing. You can feel it in the kitchen, the way she opens the refrigerator and stands there longer than usual. The way she moves things around on the shelf without taking anything out. She is not looking for food, she is doing arithmetic. And the numbers are not working. She is counting the days against what is left and deciding who gets what, and in what order, and what can be stretched one more time before it becomes something else entirely. This is that part of the week. Number 10. Potato and meat hash. By Thursday, the ratio had completely inverted. It was no longer beef stretched with starch. It was starch flavored by beef. She diced 5 heavy russet potatoes into small rough cubes and dropped them into the cast iron skillet with a heavy pour of vegetable oil. She fried them until the edges blistered and browned, scraping the bottom of the pan every few minutes so nothing burned. Then she folded in the last 1/4 pound of ground beef, breaking it apart with a wooden spoon until the pieces scattered through the potatoes and disappeared into the crust. The children could smell meat. They could taste the fat in every bite. But if you looked at the pan before it hit the table, the beef was invisible, not the main course. A seasoning, a memory of a meal that used to have more in it. Number 9. Beef grease over rice. When the meat was entirely gone, the fat remained. She kept a repurposed Folgers coffee can on the back left corner of the stove. Every time she browned beef, she tilted the skillet and poured the rendered grease into that can. By the end of the week, the surface had congealed into a pale, yellowish solid with a dark brown layer underneath where the meat drippings had settled. She spooned it over a bowl of plain white rice still hot from the pot. The grease melted into the rice, coating each grain, turning them a faint tan color. It tasted like the ghost of every meal that had come before it. The children ate it without complaint. There was nothing else. Number 8. Cabbage and beef skillet. A head of green cabbage was one of the cheapest, heaviest things you could buy in the produce aisle. A grandmother in Detroit would shred an entire head into long, thin strips, letting it wilt down in a deep skillet with a single chopped yellow onion and whatever ground beef was left from Tuesday's dinner. The cabbage released its water as it cooked, filling the kitchen with a heavy, sulfurous smell that seeped into the curtains and the couch cushions and the coats hanging by the door. The neighbors knew what kind of week it had been by the smell in the hallway. The cabbage absorbed the grease and took on a savory, dense profile. It sat in the stomach like a lead weight. Number 7. Mock Salisbury steak. She started it an hour before dinner. The smell of browning beef in the cast iron pan moved through the apartment before anyone could see what was on the stove. The children came to the kitchen doorway. They smelled meat. They assumed steak. She let them assume it. She had already mixed the dry oatmeal and the crushed breadcrumbs into the raw beef, working it together with her hands until the texture changed from loose to dense, and she had patted the mixture into 4 distinct oval shapes, the way she had seen done in a magazine once. She seared them in the pan until the outside held together, then covered them in a dark brown gravy made from 2 beef bouillon cubes dissolved in hot water and thickened with a heavy spoonful of flour. The gravy was the color of something expensive. She carried the plates to the table. It had the shape of a steak. It had the color of it, too. She set the plates down and went back to the kitchen before anyone took a bite. She already knew what it tasted like. She had been making it for 3 weeks. Number 6. Shipwreck casserole, a layer of sliced potatoes on the bottom of the glass baking dish. A can of baked beans poured over the top. Half an onion diced and scattered across the surface. A dusting of whatever browned meat was left, pressed into the beans so it wouldn't dry out in the oven. She covered it with foil and baked it at 350 for an hour. The corners burned black and stuck hard to the glass. In the morning, you scraped it loose with a fork and ate it cold standing at the counter before school. It tasted like the bottom of the pan. You ate all of it. 5 nights into the week. The pantry was almost empty. The casserole dish was scraped clean. The coffee can of grease on the back of the stove was getting low. And somewhere in a boardroom in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the people who made the food that filled these pantries were looking at sales data. They were watching what working-class families were buying and in what quantities and at what intervals. They were watching the substitutions, the generic brands replacing the name brands, the flour and the oats and the crushed crackers filling the space where the meat used to be. They were not watching with concern, they were watching with interest. We look back at these casseroles and hash skillets as testaments to maternal grit. The accepted story is that American mothers simply tightened their belts and improvised their way through the recessions of the 1970s. But while mothers were doing the math at the kitchen table, the food industry was taking notes. In 1971, General Mills realized that mothers were already using cheap pasta and powdered bouillon to stretch their hamburger meat. They boxed the exact same cheap filler, loaded it with sodium, and sold it back to the exhausted mothers at a premium. Hamburger Helper wasn't a solution. It was an invoice. Number 5. Soup extended burgers. A mother would open a tin of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and slide the gelatinous gray cylinder directly into a mixing bowl with raw ground beef. The condensed soup acted as both a binder and a liquid filler. When it hit the hot skillet, the patties didn't sear. They steamed in the chemical salt and MSG of the soup. The meat became loose and wet, impossible to put on a bun. It had to be ladled over cheap white toast. The metallic aftertaste of the tin can lingered long after the plate was clean. She made 4 of them from half a pound of beef. There were 5 people at the table. She told the children she wasn't hungry. Number 4. Tater tot hot dish. A 9x13 Pyrex dish with a thin, almost invisible layer of browned beef and canned green beans spread across the bottom. But the real work happened on the surface. A mother would stand in the kitchen, meticulously arranging frozen Ore-Ida tater tots in perfectly symmetrical, unbroken rows across the entire top of the dish. She pressed each one gently into place so the edges touched. The precision wasn't for presentation, it was architectural armor. The dense grid of golden crispy potatoes was designed to completely hide the fact that there was barely any protein underneath. You broke through the crust with a metal spatula. The illusion shattered, and the plate became a messy pile of cheap starch. The children filled up on the potatoes before they ever noticed the meat was missing. She watched them eat and did not say anything about what was underneath. By the end of the week, there was nothing left to divide, only decisions about who would eat. Number 3. Ground beef in baked beans. She opened the can with the manual twist opener and poured the thick dark beans into the pot over low heat. Then she opened the refrigerator and scraped the last fragmented crumbs of ground beef from the glass dish on the second shelf, the ones too small to use for anything else, and stirred them into the beans. The meat dissolved into the sauce within minutes. The pot smelled like something substantial. The bowls looked full. There were maybe 3 true bites of beef distributed across 5 servings. You ate the beans slowly, looking for the meat, finding it in small pieces that were gone before you registered them. Number 2. The cast iron scrape. When the skillet was empty and the meal was done and the plates were at the table, she stayed at the stove. She tore the stale heels off the end of the bread loaf, the pieces nobody wanted, and used them to wipe the rendered fat and burnt crumbs from the bottom of the heavy black skillet. She worked the bread into the corners and along the pour spout and across the flat center where the meat had sat. Not a single calorie was allowed to go down the drain. She folded the bread in half and ate it over the sink before she carried the pan to the dishwater. Number 1. The quarter-pound split. 3 ways. The meals were never plated at the dining room table. They were always plated at the stove. This was not an accident. A mother standing over the skillet with a slotted spoon, dividing a quarter-pound of meat among 3 plates, needed the distance between the pan and the table. She used the slots to drain the gravy back into the skillet, ensuring her children got the actual solid chunks of beef. She worked quickly, counting the pieces without appearing to count them, distributing them by weight and size so no child's plate looked different from another. When it was time to make her own plate, she used the spoon to scrape the remaining starch, the filler, and the gray sauce into a shallow bowl. She carried the 3 plates to the Formica table first, set them down, went back for her bowl. She sat down and told her children she simply wasn't that hungry tonight. She had been saying it for 3 days. They had stopped questioning it. She watched them eat the protein while she swallowed the filler in silence. When they finished, she asked if anyone wanted more. Nobody did. She cleared the plates. She did not tell them there was nothing left to give. She stacked the plates without looking at what was left on them, carried them to the sink, turned on the hot water. There were dozens more ways families stretched this. We'll come back to them.